talk about why the environment really is something we should care about and why we should be looking towards innovative solutions, particularly birthed by the free market and innovation unleashing the unlimited potential of each and every individual, with our first guest of the day. Danielle Butcher is the Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Conservation Coalition, and she joins us now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads with Jimmy Sengenberger today. Danielle, welcome to the show. Good to have you.
Hey, Jimmy. Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be here during Earth Week and for your first Free to Choose episode.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's so great to have you here. So let me ask you a question. Why does the environment matter so much to you and Benji Backer, who founded American Conservation Coalition, and what is the coalition?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, I think that the environment matters to everyone for very personal reasons. I think that everyone has a story as to why they care about the environment and how the environment has kind of left an impact on them. I mean, I know you're in Colorado with the beautiful Rocky Mountains. How could you not care about nature when you have those in your backyard? I'm from northern Minnesota, so I have lakes and water everywhere. I grew up on the water and going to the beaches, and so it's important to me, and I grew up seeing in my backyard just how much of an impact we could have on our natural surroundings. So that's why I care about the environment. And my organization, the American Conservation Coalition, is a group of people who care about the environment and solutions can come and utilize their conservative principles for those solutions. So we were founded in 2017 by a group of young people who cared about the environment and were tired of being told that conservatives didn't care about the environment.
You know, it's so important to keep in mind just that basic point, the idea that conservatives do not care about the environment. I mean, you were talking about Minnesota. I'm talking about Colorado. If you are living in a state especially, I mean, look, the United States, we are blessed with so much natural beauty everywhere across the country, but especially in places like what we're talking about. Or I'm originally from upstate New York, and the Adirondack Mountains are absolutely gorgeous as well. You cannot help but think we need to protect our environment because we have to be able to enjoy it. We have to be able to have clean air day to day in our daily lives. And then also, we need to make sure that our kids and grandkids are well off to enjoy the environment too.
Absolutely. I think it's really important. And listen, the natural beauty of this country is a part of our heritage. There's no question that we should protect it.
Something else that I've noticed is that if you look at the development of economies across the globe, I mean, the United States and Western Europe, we're able to protect the environment and take initiatives to do so of our own accord because we're not scraping for food day in and day out. Generally, I mean, of course, we're going through a big economic crisis right now, but by and large, the average year in this country, people are doing very well. Even now, people do very well compared to other countries that are very impoverished, and therefore, they're just trying to figure out how they're going to put food on the table for the next day for their families, maybe making $1 a day. They don't have sort of the luxury of protecting the environment. It's wonderful that here in the United States, we have that economic prosperity that makes it possible for us to really care about the environment and act accordingly, I would say.
I completely agree, and I think that's something that the left oftentimes gets wrong about environmentalism, is it is truly a privilege to have so few problems that we can turn our attention to environmental problems, and we're not worried about putting food on the table, and we're not worried making sure our homes are warm in the winter or things like that. It is so important that we recognize the privilege we have in this conversation and recognize that we have that privilege because we've realized that economic success and environmental success have to go hand in hand.
Now, when you're out and about with young people, college campuses, people mid-late 20s, I'm in my late 20s, or teenagers, and talking with younger people, millennials and Gen Z, and you express, okay, we care about the environment, we just think there's another way to go about it. How do you have those conversations, and how do they go?
You know, I think environmental issues and especially climate change are definitely a generational issue. And so when you're talking to a younger demographic, those conversations are definitely very easy to start out because you have some common ground. I don't know a single young person who would say they don't enjoy being out outside, hiking, fishing, whatever it is. And so I think that you have to first establish that you have that common ground and then explain that you do care about the environment. You just have a different way of going about protecting it and explaining the theory behind that way and why you think it's better than the failed approaches we've used in the past. I found most people to be pretty open-minded to that.
Yeah, I think the number one reason why, in your experience, they are more open-minded to it, and in my experience as well, is because we're not just saying no to a Green New Deal, for example. You have alternative solutions that you put forward at the American Conservation Coalition. I've done the same through my work at the Millennial Policy Center and elsewhere. When you have those conversations about solutions, I think it comes down to you actually have ideas in the first place. So what is the basic premise that you come across, that you come at these issues on, Danielle Butcher, when it comes to the public policy space and what to do to actually protect the environment the right way?
Absolutely tried to tackle these problems. It's been regulation, it's been expanding government, it's been taking away property rights, and frankly that's just not the right way to go about it, and we've seen that in the results that we've achieved. We have not had the environmental outcomes that we have desired. Climate change is still a huge issue. Conservation is still a huge issue. Plastic pollution, the plastic straw bans, is still a huge issue. And so I think at some point you just have to have a moment of self-reflection and realize, okay, this approach hasn't worked. It's time to try something new. And at the American Conservation Coalition, we believe that that something new is innovation. It's empowering inventors to create new technology that will reduce emissions and that will clean up our environment. It's competition, so it's allowing energy companies and energy sources to compete with one another so that you're providing the cleanest energy possible, but also at the lowest cost to the consumer. And it's about personal responsibility, right? It's about recognizing that somebody who lives in Colorado and has the Rocky Mountains in their backyard knows how to take care of that better than in Washington, D.C.
I think that's very true. Well said. By the way, you're cutting in and out a little bit, so I think our signal's a little bit weak, but we got what you were saying for the most part there, Danielle Butcher, again, our guest from the American Conservation Coalition. So let's dive in a little bit more into some of these specifics. I mean, you guys talk about the American Conservation Coalition's principles of limited government environmentalism. Talk to us a little bit about that, because I think principles are a critical starting point to any discussion about public policy, because you can't really get effective policy unless you understand what you're going for first.
Absolutely. I think that first of all, any public policy decisions that are being made need to be made at the most local level possible. And I think that the conservative ideology in the GOP is uniquely positioned to do this, because when you look at our voting demographic, we are the people who live in rural areas. We are the people who work in agriculture, or the sportsmen, or the people who go out and hike. And so those people who are connected to the land and live in the land, they know how to care for it better than anyone else. And so rather than allowing the federal government to make decisions on how to conserve that land and how to protect that land, to put it back in the hand, actually have a say in that.
Danielle Butcher, again, our guest from the American Conservation Coalition. So when it comes to the argument that government doesn't work, I mean, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this with Nick Loris from the Heritage Foundation in the next segment. But overall, if you're saying, hey, these are the basic principles in terms of a limited government approach, and then you want to get to the policies, it's also important to at least lay the groundwork for why the way things have been done as far as looking to the government as the savior, if you will, and protector of the environment, the all-knowing, all-powerful steward, shall we say, that saying why that is the failed approach and not the right approach. What's your overarching assessment of the government knows best attitude? And then we'll get into some of the specifics, especially on climate change, of how you think we should address these environmental concerns.
Sure. The conservative doesn't believe there's no government at all in environmental protection. It just means that you believe in smart and efficient government protection or government involvement. And so there are a place for smart regulations. There is a place for some government, but I think that too often government goes overboard, and when it isn't effective, that course is not corrected. And look, I think that as conservatives, it's like a tenet of our belief system that the market can solve problems much more efficiently and much faster and cheaper than government ever could. And so what we need to be doing is empowering the market to harness its power and address these challenges.
So on climate change, I mean, this is clearly for millennials and Generation Z. It is a top concern, and not just of people who are on the left. There are young people on the right who are concerned about this. Now, they're not saying necessarily that the world's going to end in what I think it's 11 years now, that we lost a year from the 12 that were originally projected till the end of the world. But it is an issue that I think the vast majority of people, especially, let's say, under 40, under 35, are genuinely concerned about for a variety of different reasons. I myself think that it is a legitimate issue to address, but to do it in a smart and strategic way. So, two-part question for you, Danielle Butcher. First of all, what do you think the science says about climate change and the level of threat that it may pose? And then what's your overarching assessment, and we'll get into it a little bit deeper, of what should be done to address it if it is a concern?
Absolutely. I believe the science is very clear that the climate is changing, and I believe that humans do have an impact on it. Now, that being said, I don't think it serves us to get caught up in this debate, because the solutions that conservatives have to these challenges are good for the economy. So whether or not the climate is changing, which I believe it is, still good things to do for the environment in general. And I think you can see the effects of climate change firsthand if you live in a coastal community where it's flooding, or if you live in
Having a little bit of signal issues here with Danielle Butcher, our guest, again, Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President at the American Conservation Coalition. Sorry, Danielle, you froze up there for a moment. So go back about 30 seconds, please.
No worries about that. As I was saying, I believe the climate is changing. I believe humans do have an impact on it. That being said, it doesn't serve us to get caught up in this argument about how severe the problem may be. What we need to be doing is looking at solutions that we can enact now that will be good for the economy and good for the environment.
I think that's a fundamental point that I make when I talk with older conservatives about how to win over young people and not just dismiss the issue of climate change. And in part, it's that, look, if you have less government regulation, that's a good thing for the economy, but also if you have the proper incentives in place just simply to protect the environment, then why not go for that? Why not try to unleash that innovation to address environmental concerns? So in terms of the climate change discussion then, what do you think needs to happen? I mean, we hear talk about implementing more nuclear power and carbon capture technology. We hear discussions about enhancing property rights in certain ways. So what are some different avenues that you think we should be looking at the American Conservation Coalition from a free market standpoint when it comes to climate change?
Absolutely. So my organization, the American Conservation Coalition, actually just released our response to the Green New Deal. It is a conservative climate change program, and identify 4 key areas that we believe we need to focus on in order to address climate change, and that is energy innovation, 21st century infrastructure, a global approach, and natural solutions. So basically meaning those are the 4 areas we believe we can hone in on and make a difference to reduce emissions. And I want to touch really quickly on the global approach section of that, because I think it's very important for us to recognize the United States is a global leader. That being said, we only account for about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we could do everything right. We could have every regulation and reduce our emissions to net zero, and it would not matter if other countries were not willing to follow in our footsteps. And so that's why I think it's so important to lead with innovation, because you're not going to convince a developing country to implement our tax code or to implement our regulations that will stifle their economy. But what you can convince them to use is new technology that's going to create jobs and stimulate their economy. That's why I think when we're thinking of how to address climate change, we need to think bigger than our own country. We need to figure out how we can enact change globally.
Although, oftentimes, Danielle, when we hear the term global approach put out, it's like, okay, that means we need to have a Paris Climate Accord. And how dare President Donald Trump remove the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement? How dare the Trump administration step back from a leadership role? What you're talking about doesn't sound to me like it's that. The United States signing on to global agreements from a top-down, government knows best sort of attitude, but something a little bit different. Explain the distinction.
Absolutely. I think the Paris Climate Accord, to be frank, is massively virtue signaling. You look at the emissions targets that they have set, and almost none of the countries that have signed on are on track to reach those targets. And I would say, what is the point in setting this goal if you have no idea how you are going to achieve that goal? So I think that at ACC, we lead with the solution and we say, okay, this is what we can do right now to get us to this goal in the future, rather than saying goal that we want to hit. I don't know how we're going to get there, but it'll happen magically.
When it comes to the technology piece on the international stage, one thing that I have noticed is the development of fracking technology and improvements. I mean, clearly we have a situation going on with energy markets right now, but it's an anomaly due to the coronavirus crisis and related issues. As of the last couple of years, the United States has become a net exporter in oil and gas, which is pretty much unprecedented. I don't think it's been since like the 40s or 50s that we've had anything of the sort like this, and it's particularly because of the natural gas revolution with fracking. And one thing I look at is you have these politicos and people on the left who say, what we need to do is get developing nations to start building solar panels and windmills and so forth. And my thought on that has been, first of all, those are just not you cannot price them at a level that a developing country can actually afford, first of all. Second of all, and this is a sign of improved economic growth and prosperity, actually, we're seeing electrical grids more and more popping up because of coal that has been usable in these developing nations. And so more and more countries over the last 30 years have been using coal to power their economies. And that's been great for prosperity, for people's health and so forth. But the problem is, of course, that it's a dirtier source of fuel when we're talking coal. Natural gas, especially now how it's produced and used, is remarkably efficient, significantly less carbon intensive than coal is when you use it. And it's also something that can be transported to other countries. In my view, we should unleash more natural gas production and encourage exports to developing countries and help them build that infrastructure more so that we can implement lower carbon emitting natural gas in more parts of the world.
It's absolutely true. The United States is a world leader in emissions reductions, and that's exclusively because of natural gas taking the place of coal as an energy source. And I think what's really interesting about the climate change conversation and how it relates to energy is that if you want to combat climate change, your number one goal should be reducing emissions. And when you get into this conversation with some people who may be left of center, they tend to only want to focus on wind and solar, and that's fine. Wind and solar certainly have their place in our energy grid, but there is no good reason to dismiss low emission energy sources such as natural gas or hydro or nuclear energy in this conversation, because those are effective ways to reduce emissions. And it seems like there's some sort of purity test for which energy is acceptable for reducing emissions, when the fact of the matter is we would not be able to reduce emissions at the rate that we have if it were not for these technologies and energy forms that the left doesn't want to use.
That's so well put. It is an all-of-the-above approach that we should be taking, and allow, by the way, the market to work to implement the most efficient, lowest-cost sources of energy. And maybe that's wind and solar at some point. Right now, it's certainly natural gas is playing a pivotal role there. Just a couple minutes left with you, Danielle Butcher from the American Conservation Coalition. I want to ask you about property rights. I love that ACC emphasizes the role of property rights when it comes to the environment, because it actually produces an incentive to conserve resources and to make sure that we are good stewards of the environment. Explain for just a moment the role of property rights, what they are, and why they're actually a critical thing that often gets lost in the conversation about the environment.
Absolutely. I think the role of property rights in environmental protection can best be described by the tragedy of the commons,
Mm.
which is to say, when everyone is responsible for taking care of something, no one steps up to the plate because they just assume that someone else will do it. And when you have ownership of something, you have a vested interest in taking care of it and in making sure that it is as good as it can be. And that is why property rights are so, so important in environmental protection.
And Danielle Butcher, before we let you go, and we could go at this for a while talking into the weeds more on some of these areas, and I appreciate the time. Please tell us where people can go so they can learn more about what the American Conservation Coalition is doing, and also some of the ideas that you've put forward that are much more about how can we address environmental concerns without an overburdening government.
Absolutely. If you want to find us on Twitter, you can do so at AT_national. You can check out our newly released climate change platform from a conservative perspective at climatesolution.eco.
And so you cut out one point, so I do want to say acc.eco. Where are you on social media as well?
ACC_national on Instagram and Twitter.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Danielle Butcher from the American Conservation Coalition, COO and EVP there. Really appreciate what you're doing and appreciate your time today on our inaugural Free to Choose Friday here on Jimmy at the Crossroads.
Thanks, Jimmy. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Again, Danielle Butcher, they're doing really great work at the American Conservation Coalition. I love the approach. See, folks, it's about proposition, not just opposition. You just watched a clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel today. You want to catch our live show. And I love your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.
Awesome.